Right, welcome everyone. This is our last Global Research and Policy Seminar. My name is Michaela Papa. I'm Director of Research and Principal Research Scientist here at MIT Center for International Studies. I'm very, very honored to introduce our speaker today. We have a seminar on sanctions spillover and trade diversification, and our speaker is Professor Christina Davis. Professor Christina Davis is the Edwin O. Reischauer Professor of Japanese Politics in the Department of Government and Director of the Program on U.S. Japan Relations at Harvard University. She studies the politics and foreign policy of Japan, East Asia, and international organizations with a focus on trade policy. She's the author of Discriminatory Clubs, The Geopolitics of International Organizations, and Why Adjudicate Enforcing Trade Rules in the WTO, as well as numerous other publications in leading journals. We are very grateful that you're joining us today. Thank you so much. Please, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you for the nice introduction. I'm very grateful to Michaela and Evan for inviting me and for all of you coming to hear my talk. I'm especially glad to have a second chance after the first schedule in February was snowed out and we have much better weather. So I'm impressed you all are not out enjoying the sun and flowers, but I will do my best to entertain with a discussion about sanctions. And this project on sanctions spillover and trade diversification is joint work with Ruofan Ma, who is here. And I think you already know he's amazing because he's going to be joining your department as an assistant professor soon. And this project we've been working on actually for several years. And so this is a great opportunity for us to get one last round of comments before we start thinking about sending it out into the world. The question that motivated us is, like all of you, we're looking at this world with so many sanctions and thinking about their impact and trying to consider different ways that sanctions impact the world economy. And it's important to think about systemic risk, not just the individual episode where two countries are going back and forth with sanctions, but rather how does the rise of sanctions shape the entire system? Now, the background of why we think it's really important is interdependence has deepened over the last decades to the point where, with low transportation costs and rules of rule-based order, countries started to think that they could completely have division of labor, complex supply chains, where trade is much more disaggregated and much more extensive, both in what is traded and how many partners you have and how important the goods are that you depend on the world to supply. And so this leads to a sense of vulnerability. There's uncertainty because your dependence being great, any disruption could have serious consequences. And that also becomes a source of leverage so that countries are more likely to start to intervene using economic statecraft as a tool of foreign policy. And so we know that there's anything from a random disruption due to a tsunami or a deliberate disruption due to sanctions or war can have widespread consequences. We wanted to look at this, especially in light of the increasing use of sanctions, which is one form of disruption of global economy. And we're seeing more and more actors and more issues that are becoming the subject of sanctions. So where it may have been once that sanctions were largely about punishing a country that is invading its neighbor, now we see sanctions used for human rights, environmental goals, and a wide set of issues. Where once sanctions might have been country to country, now we see smart sanctions that may target an individual or a company, whether it's Huawei or the oligarch in Russia. And it's led by the United States, which certainly issues the most sanctions and has the most variety of sanctions. But actually, there are many other countries that are also participating in sanctions, from Europe to China. And we also see sanctions as particularly destabilizing because of the fact that they are so prone to escalation. Our rules-based order, even at its best, did not try to restrain sanctions for foreign policy. There's a recognition that countries' sovereignty relies on some discretion to decide what is your national security. What are your moral interests? And so as the World Trade Organization expanded rules, they have very carefully crafted waivers that provide discretion to countries to suspend the trade rules in the case of national security. And there's also wide exceptions for health, environment, and moral. And that allows the use of sanctions to often be less restrained in the international economy. So these are some of the reasons that we think that it's important to look at sanctions as a source of systemic risk. What is the impact of sanctions? That's our question today. Now I'm going to try and talk for 25 minutes because I really do want to get to your questions. Happy to take clarifying questions along the way, if that's your norm. So just raise your hand if you're not following something in the talk. A key point is that we're looking beyond the dyad of the country sending a sanction against a specific target. We're looking at others that are affected. A lot of research, I'm not even going to cite it because it's so broad, and trust me, the paper cites a lot of this research that focuses on the countries that are involved in the sanction event, the country that sends the sanction and the country that's targeted. But we're looking at the wider implications for the network because of the fact that global value chains connect so many together, and that sanctions are going to cause risk for overall market stability, undermine confidence that all trade is going to be as it was yesterday, that there could be these unexpected shocks. You may find you are next in line as the next target of sanctions. You may not be targeted, but your supply chain is disrupted. This means that all market participants may feel that there's an increase in risk. We're going to look at this question about sanction spillover and how it affects trade patterns of third parties, those that are experiencing sanctions, and often we're looking at this as their own trade with a country that is under sanctions is what is exposing them to make them especially aware about the risk of sanction disruption. How are states managing this kind of trade risk? We look at two simplified approaches of thinking of different strategies you might take to reduce your risk in this type of global interdependence, rising sanctions. One is concentration. Focus your trade, fewer partners, produce more at home, and that would lower your exposure to sanctions uncertainty. Or any financial advisor says if there's risk, diversify. So diversification is a strategy where you would spread your trade, more partners, more products, so that any specific disruption would have less impact. We're arguing that diversification has a lot of advantages because it allows you to build on many different markets for this uncertainty about where the next shock could come. And geopolitical divisions and rivalries are complicated. You may not want to take sides. So spreading out rather than concentrating. It also requires less state intervention because you're really saying, all right, wider, whereas to narrow forces a lot of coercion of firm and private actors. Expanding commercial opportunities, like I say, a good financial advisor might well say diversify, so firms are used to this as a response to uncertainty. Our argument is the exposure to sanctions is going to lead countries to diversify their trade, lowering concentration. Now, it is happening through the actions of firms and governments. We are not able to parse that out. We think it is a joint process where firms are responding to the market uncertainty, signals from their governments about risk, and governments are making selective interventions. And so we are going to be looking at an aggregate country level analysis, and we're going to then parse it down to a product level. We do not have firm level analysis. What we're going to look at is how do countries change their trade flows through who they trade with, their choice of trade partners, and what do they trade? Their goods. As I said, they can increase their trade partners. Reducing the concentration would be one strategy. They could decide that they want to have less concentration of trade goods, so they expand the number of products that they're trading and make sure that they're covering their bases. So these are two simple ways that you could expect countries to try to lower the concentration of trade partners, lower the concentration of trade goods. We're going to look at how this happens in response to sanctions spillover. How do you measure sanctions spillover? Because we're trying to think about the third parties, the bystanders that are exposed through their trade flows to think that sanctions are risky. And so we're going to define sanctions spillover as the ratio between the trade with sanctioned countries and the trade volume. Higher values would mean you have more of your trade with sanctioned countries. You're more likely to be exposed to sanctions, feel this is a great risk, and therefore have these responses of diversification in our argument. Lower values on sanctions spillover, you're less exposed to sanctions through your trade. You might be less likely to show this diversification pattern. One example to just illustrate is, think about Belarus. 2013, they had a 28% ratio of trade with sanctioned countries relative to their total trade. After their first trade partner, Russia, becomes subjected to sanctions after the start of the war with Ukraine in 2014, there was a major increase in our measure of sanctions spillover to a 0.87. So that's an example where through a major trade partner having a sudden increase in sanctions, you'd see an increase in the measure. Any questions about our hypotheses or the spillover? Our key explanatory, wait, I skipped one. Trade concentration is the outcome. And here we're going to be looking at how concentrated is your trade. Herfindahl-Hirschman index is a common approach to measuring concentration. We have two versions because we want to first look at your concentration of trade partners. So this is across all of your trade, aggregating how much is your trade through a small set of partners versus how much is it spread out across many partners. And then we look at it at the product level in terms of how concentrated is your goods trade at the product level. Simple interpretation is going to be that the higher value means you have more concentrated trade, and the lower value is going to be diversified trade. We're going to test this with a broad sample looking at the full period from 1990 to 2020, where you feel that interdependence is high, and yet it's after the Cold War, this era of expanding value chains, globalization, and yet we cut off where we start to get the pandemic disrupting trade and other challenges. The sanction database is allowing us to have a broad set of sanctions, trade, financial, multilateral, unilateral, and we're going to be focusing on those that invoke trade measures. And so we have 734 sanctions. About 10% are multilateral UN sanctions. We also look at excluding those and focusing on not the multilateral. The US is leading, but we will look also at excluding the US-led sanctions. We want to look at trade data with both the bilateral trade flows as well as the product level, 4 digits, so that's fairly fine-grained. Looking at country dyads. Remember, we're trying to aggregate to the country level, thinking about a country that across their trade partners is more exposed to sanctions, across their trade portfolio of goods is more exposed to trade sanctions. How does that country year experience of exposure to sanctions spillover change that country's diversification of their trade, which we're measuring with the Herfindahl index? Our model specification is going to be looking at trade concentration and how the spillover shapes trade. We'll look forward to see how long the effect lasts. Two-way fixed effects model to evaluate the extent to which spillovers are going to affect trade diversification. We have sanction spillover as our key explanatory variable, and we're going to include control variables, GDP per capita, democracy, trade volume, are you a member of the WTO, the EU? Country and fixed effects will absorb some of the common shocks, and we'll be looking at this lead year's impact over time. This is the simple result of the effect. And remember, the negative effect is showing that as you have more sanction spillover, you are reducing your concentration. So this is supporting our expectation of more diversification as they're adding more trade partners. And it is, 0.05 in the first year, but increasing by, if you look at the average effect over 5 years, substantively, that's equivalent to the 5-year before and after China joining the WTO. When China joined the WTO, it diversified its trade partners quite a bit. And we're finding that an increase of sanction spillover also causes that type of spreading your trade out more. This effect over the 5-year average is also equivalent to comparing the level of trade partner diversification of the United States, very diversified, with Oman, less diversified. So substantively, it's an important effect. We also find a null result for goods trade. So we'd expected to see it on both sides, but we don't see anything on the product trade, which it may be that this is difficult to measure the product level and there's a lot more noise in this analysis. And it could also be that bringing production home is just not the strategy that is being taken. And so we don't see the reshoring at the product diversification level taking place. But what is happening? Like, if you're adding more trade partners, who are you adding? And we wanted to look a little bit more at this. And so here we go and look at, who are you changing your trade partner with? And they're actually increasing trade with allies. So it is friendshoring, but it isn't the friendshoring where you just reduce to the smaller set of a couple of allies you were already trading with. So there's one version of friendshoring that would be more concentration. You used to trade with 50, now you trade with only your 5 allies. Instead, we're seeing that if you didn't trade much with some allies, you're expanding your trade with allies and making sure that if you cut off trade, it's maybe with a non-ally where you're reducing a trade partner. So on average, the trade shift is going to a higher ratio of trade with your allies. And so we shifted the specification here so that we were looking at an outcome of what share of your trade is with allies, and we see that it's increasing. We also see that there's an increase in trade partners where you have preferential trade agreements. And so this helps to show there is a government effort to help expand trade, that as countries have more sanction spillover, the governments are working harder to use PTAs, and this is helping to lead to more trade with these PTA partners. And the WTO generally is the safer bet. So if you're expanding trade with new partners, on average, it's with WTO members. So we're finding that there's spillover at the country level. Now, everybody likes to analyze trade dyadic, bilateral flows. So we did take your standard gravity model to just look at bilateral trade flows. And here we're just finding that the explanatory variable of sanction spillover on average reduces your imports with any other state, which is consistent with the idea you're spreading your imports out over more states. So your average imports with any one state is lower. Now, in the back of your mind, you're being shy and not interrupting me, but I bet every one of you is like, it's all evasion. And there's lots of missing trade that is just being shipped through as transshipment. And I'm not going to deny that that happens. Armenia gets some Russian goods that come through Armenia and go on to Europe. And that's part of what could be diversification. So we wanted to check and make sure that's not the only thing happening. Another question you might have is that it could be pressure from the United States on countries, which is part of this. So we want to look at risk mitigation versus sanction sender pressure. So first, the sanction sender pressure. We test, okay, we've been looking at your trade with a sanction target. What if it's actually your trade with a sanction sender? So we switch the specification to say, let's look at how much you trade with this country that is sending sanctions. And that's what's really pushing everything. And we don't get the same result. So, we do believe that it's much more how much you're trading with the targets that leads to this rather than the sender. As for that transshipment, we can't deny it happens, but we take a first cut look where we say, if it's all transshipment, you'd see lots of unexpected new product flows. where, at the 4-digit level, you'd see something you never traded before suddenly appears because it's just being shipped through from one of the other countries. And so we look at this. Do you see a lot of unexpected new product flows? And we don't. That, like I say, that doesn't deny that there is some transshipment, but it's one way to look at it. Others, like Eddie Molesky at a country level, have been looking at it for Vietnam and finding that there's a mix. There's some transshipment, but a lot is not. It's actual new production. So we're just trying to look at that question. We also look a little bit at product heterogeneity. I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to say too much about this, but we do find generally that it is most of the diversification is happening through the partner. Even if we change the way we look at products, that's not shifting how the partner relationship occurs. We also do find that when we try to give a little more attention to what is being traded, that there is much more for the final goods than the intermediate goods, which makes sense that if you're going to diversify at the goods level, it would be the final goods you can change more quickly, whereas a lot of the intermediate goods are very relationship specific. And so at least when we start looking a little more closely at the product level, we find some interesting patterns. But I do want to take my last 10 minutes to sort of switch gears. I've been talking about global effects, aggregate a lot of different sanctions in different countries. And you probably still are a little worried about selection and who's trading with sanctioned targets. And you're probably worried about transshipment. And so one way to get at those questions and more precision is to look at a very unusual case. And so I'd like to take my next 10 minutes to talk about an interesting case where I can hone in on one shock that is like a sanction, but it came suddenly and broadly, and I can look at really narrow product data. So we're going to look at the Section 232 tariffs. What are they? Actually, I suspect most of you know by now. When we started this project, has it been 4 or 5? I think 4 years ago, maybe we had to explain this more, and now people have sort of gotten up to speed on trade, but in March 2018, in his first administration, President Trump announced that he would implement 25% tariff on steel, 10% tariff on aluminum on the basis of national security. So this 1962 law has Section 232, which allows, in the name of national security, an executive action to raise tariffs. Normally, our Constitution does set tariffs in the Congress, but this gave more flexibility for some change in tariffs. It's important you know this because after the other tariffs by the Trump administration and the current administration, under an Emergency Powers Act, were ruled illegal by the Supreme Court a few months ago. Now, the new approach is to ramp up this strategy using Section 232. So the policy tool we're using in our paper may soon become the entirety of U.S. tariff sanction policy. But the key point is it's an unusual way to make tariffs. You're only using the tariff in the name of national security. And so that's why we say it's a geopolitical risk, that it's different than protectionism. Our steel industry is declining. And it's sudden and universal. It came surprisingly. It had simmered along. There was an investigation, but no one was paying attention to the investigation. I knew about it, but it wasn't big news. Maybe some of the steel companies knew, so that's a bit of a challenge. But it also is unusual because, it had to be in the name of national security. It was not the same. We do in the paper, although I'm not going to talk today, compare it to some of the ordinary steel protection that came in earlier eras. Here's this argument that it was sudden attention to U.S. raising tariffs. So March 18th is the middle of the period, but we look at this after March 1 when there's the first announcement that you see an increase in the Google Trends searches of Section 232 as everyone tries to figure out what is this. It was universal. So that's, again, part of our research design is even though it was named as being against China, the world exporter of steel, every country was hit with the same 25% for steel, 10% for aluminum. second round Trump administration, they went up to 50%, but we're focused on the first because it was more of a surprise. The second administration, it becomes very conflated. Here it is hitting our allies. And so that helps us is that it's not as strategic, it's against everyone at once. We're going to try and look at a parallel structure of there's some countries that are directly hit because the US is their top market and they're the equivalent of those hit by a direct sanction. But again, we're interested in the third parties that are sort of the bystander. And so we're looking now, how do we separate out those most affected from the bystanders who are really affected because they're trading with the ones that are hit by the US decision? And so what we do is we have one group of countries that are target where the US is their top market. That's China. But the spillover countries, the equivalent to our earlier analysis of spillover, are indirectly exposed because they're trading with one of those that's a top trader with the US, a country like Japan. And the control group is all the rest who they're not as expected because they didn't trade top with the US or even with those who trade indirectly through the US. In Germany, much of its trade is with other partners. And so we're going to look at how those differences and how exposed you were to the US ramping up tariffs on steel and looking at how that spillover group in the middle is the most likely to say, all right, we're going to expand our number of partners, diversification, and we're going to trade less with the US in steel, goods diversification. And, here we're much more fine-tuned than that first analysis. It's monthly data at the detailed product level. And we're going to look at difference in difference estimation. We're going to have covariate balancing, propensity score, using the same covariates that before per cap, income and trade volumes. Looking at the difference in difference estimate for the treated countries, comparing the most directly targeted to the spillover group, and then a second set where we say, okay, spillover group versus those that really were not as directly affected in the control. These two sets of results, the first panel on the left is just showing the expected increase of export destinations, meaning you're trading steel with more countries. When you look at the target versus control, not really a significant result. So those who are the biggest traders to the US are not actually changing their export destinations as much. It's a little increase, but not much, not significant. Whereas the right panel is our interest in the spillover group. The spillover group are those who are trading with China or trading with the other top countries. And they start to expand the number of countries they're exporting their steel to. So we do see some partner diversification. It's small and it doesn't last as long. And here we show the same where we're looking at how do they change their trade with the US and steel as a ratio. So again, the target group, there's a little bit of a decrease in how much they trade with the US. Their share of total steel trade is a little less with the US, but it's not significant. Whereas the spillover group, the right panel, you actually see a significant decrease in the share of their steel trade that is with the US. So again, what's interesting in our results here is we're seeing diversification in two different types of analyses. One where we're saying aggregate all sanctions, looking across your trade exposure, it appears you add more trade partners when you're more worried about sanctions. And we also look really close up at this US case of a national security tariff and see adding new partners. But at the same time, we do have two null findings. We didn't have much product diversification in the global analysis, and we don't see that the countries most affected by the US national security tariffs are doing as big of a change in their policy. So that's a little bit the two null findings. Overall implications from the paper is that, there is transmission of sanctions to third parties. We're seeing change in trade patterns and reaction that appears to favor de-risking. And rather than concentrating on more home production of goods, more trading with a small set of partners, we see that instead they're expanding who they trade with and adding in more trade partners. I think this is one piece of evidence that globalization is actually going to be more resilient to economic coercion. That even as there's more state intervention in the economy, it's not leading to a complete withdrawal from global trade. If there's a diversification response, countries, firms are going double down on interdependence rather than withdraw from it for now. Thank you very much for your patience. I guess you were holding all of your questions, but I think that I look forward to your questions, and I will pass the hard ones to Ruofan, who did so much of the thinking and analyzing for the paper.
So I wanted to mention that we are recording the talk, so you can have comments afterwards. I don't need to take notes. Yes.
Sure. Great talk, Christina. A question on external validity. So you were focusing on Section 232 in order to make inferences about diversification and responses to foreign policy and security sanctions. 232 has a time limit, and most foreign policy sanctions do not. That time limit that is built into Section 232 may or may not differentiate the cases that you're focusing on from more general sanctions cases. To what extent is there a problem with generalizing from your aluminum steel 232 cases to general foreign policy sanctions?
I agree. I think there's always this trade-off of we have a lot more external validity in the front end of the paper with lots of sanctions in countries, but not very good causal inference because there's so much moving that we can't really identify exactly what causes the shift in sanctions spillover. Whereas here we have much more precision for what is the shock. So I accept that trade-off. And I would say the paper as a whole is conducive to a conclusion. But it is interesting too to think about, I think you're right, we should consider the time limit when we compare to the Bush safeguard measure that was old-fashioned protection, an election promise to help West Virginia Steel, and in March 2002, imposing a safeguard. There's less time. Would they also have a time limit? So the WTO sets a time limit. And so, I could say at least within my very focused, I have two comparisons that both have some time limit. I'm still waiting for the 232 to reach its time limit. And so the other would be that I could push back on that grounds. So I guess I accept part of your question well.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much for this. I want to go back a bit to the theory in the very beginning. So if sanctions are used as a type of economic coercion that's under a strategy to change behavior of the coerced state, that's generally how it's used. 232 being a different type of sanction, which is a protectionist sanction. But the general theory of sanctions is it is part of a diplomatic strategy to change behavior. And traditionally, it's a national security behavior. So, where I thought you were going, and I think this would still be a really interesting direction, is of course, if a Russia or an Iran is sanctioned, they are going to need to find new trading partners. And is that why coercive sanctions don't work? Because that, as a policy person, is one of the questions we have. Sanctions are a tactic, not a strategy, but they're in service of a strategy of changing behavior. So is the ability and nimbleness of the sanctioned state to find new trading partners when coerced, is that part of the reason why they don't have that pinch that the sanctioned state is trying to inflict, right? And in my mind, that's a really, really relevant and really pressing question, especially with Russia being the most important recent case where there was confusion as to why the sanctions really did very little to hurt the Russian economy after 2022, especially. And then the second part of that is and I know someone here is working on their PhD on this, the second order sanctions is a variable that really matters. So when a third party state is then sanctioned for doing trade with the Irans and Russias and Cubas, that's another variable that really matters in the original theory. And so I think that would be really interesting to watch if that has a deterrent too.
Right. Thank you. Excellent questions. I'll take it as 3 points. One is I do agree that normally sanctions are a coercive tool, and the Section 232 is a different type of coercive tool. But it was in the name of national security, and it was seen as to target China, you had to target everyone because otherwise trade just follows around. And so there was a long report about the national security implications of steel. I share your skepticism that it's a different kind of argument. But the uncertainty reaction is that it was less limited than, say, the 2002 safeguard, which was blatant for an industry that is facing a flood of imports. And so I think other countries react differently to words and policy tools. And so I think that there is enough parallel to say that tariffs are becoming a sanction. But I take that point. I think the second two parts of your question are the Russia, China, and the lack of effectiveness of sanctions. There's been a wide literature on sanction effectiveness, yes, that finds it's not as powerful, and that is because the sanctioned countries can find other partners. We're not analyzing that lack of effectiveness because we are not looking at the sanction target, but our study has implications for, as a coercive tool, you hope that when you sanction Russia, you're also sending a signal to some other country that if they do bad behavior, they might be sanctioned. And when those countries have diversified after watching the sanctions against Russia and China, they're less deterred because they're like, I've got 50 partners. You could sanction me and I'll probably be covered and they'll probably trade with me. So I do think that our work on the diversification response to sanctions is part of the broader reason that sanctions have not been as effective. The direct issue about Russia finding other trade partners has been analyzed by others and has a different type of research design. But ours does speak to that, why the third party diversification could lower the next step. And if Russia had already diversified enough, that's why when they are also hit, they've already got players to turn to. So that's important. And maybe we should clarify that point. And then your last one about the second order sanctions is very important. They get a lot of news. There are not many. And so I think you're right that, the United States saying that if you trade the sanctioned country, we'll stop letting you trade with us is why some of these third parties are really anxious and can overcomply. And that starts happening pretty late and is more limited, but we need to do more, I think, both to talk about it and to do robustness checks. Although you probably already did, and I didn't. Do you have any thoughts on those questions? I shouldn't keep answering because I said I'm passing.
Yeah, I was just gonna like the similar reaction. So like there's this idea of like if like the third parties are looking at other countries that are under sanction, right? They preemptively diversify as a result, right? That just means the overall effect of like sanction are gonna decline over time, right? And then yes, with like the secondary section, yeah, it is very interesting. It's like, for instance, if you look at the Russian sort of like import, like their custom declaration, right? There are a lot of like companies, right? They like the Russians themselves say, oh, like these are the ones that we're doing trade with, which should be like a very easy list for US to take, right? So then every single person who enters this list will go on the entity list, right? But that's not the case, right? In fact, it's like very small subsection of them actually get affected, and they're like usually for like, well, like the reasons that US give are usually for like other reasons, like human rights or like forced labors. Very rarely is because of like sanction busting. So like there's like, it's very interesting, like how do they follow through on these like threats of like second order sanction, which could be very interesting to look into for like a future research project, I suppose.
Thanks, Christina. That's great. I guess my question is, so I think the implications are if you're a country that sanctions other countries a lot, like the US, and you don't want that behavior to be hurting your allies, you should constantly be promoting your allies' trade diversification. Is that right? I mean, that's what you should be kind of preemptively telling people to do, so that way you have an effective policy tool.
That's a good point. I think that's, You don't want your allies to suffer the economic harm, so then that's just about resilience. And we don't find that your dependence on the sanctioned sender is causing them to do all the diversification, but maybe they already diversified. Yeah. Does seem from the coercive tool perspective, though, you would want to be able to force your allies to do what you want. So there are different reasons you may not want your allies to be so free and safe. I think it depends if you're looking at your allies' economic strength versus vulnerability as part of the coercive tool. And so I think that's a good question to think more about the strategics from the US. And I think, the US sender not having as strong a result was a bit surprising, but it may just be because the US is sending and trades so broadly that there isn't a whole lot to identify by.
I think I guess at least in the case of Trump, the interesting thing is it's hard to figure out what he thinks are his allies, right? Like, at least in this particular, right? Like the way we've been thinking of allies are looking at, for instance, like the formal the defense alliance, or like through more expensively through like formal trade agreements, which doesn't seem to come under his consideration. But within those set of people, within those set of countries, we do see sort of like at least from a third party perspective, active effort to expand who could be potentially considered as my allies. So it's like the definition of ally also shifts, or as like countries become more exposed to like risk of sanctions.
Right. We're actually using the ATOP ally, but
Yes.
who is your ally, and degrees of it is shifting. But it could be that yes, the US did that. And so they long ago, all of our allies diversified. And that's why when we look at, are you depending on the US? Interesting. Good question.
Thank you. Thank you, Christina. So you mentioned earlier that sanctions actually undermine the rules-based order. I'm just thinking, why don't you look at it as sanctions being upholding, the rules-based order? Because in the case of Russia, and if you look at whatever the EU is doing, it's a matter of promoting the values that you hold very dearly, rather than seeing it as coercion. And then my second question is about the Section 301. How do you see the difference between the Section 301 with 232, as you mentioned earlier?
Okay, right. Yes, it depends when we say rules-based order, which rules we're thinking about. And so I think that's a useful clarification that sanctions against Russia for invading Ukraine are part of enforcing the United Nations principles. And so I take your point that that actually supports a rule-based order. Within the global economy, the World Trade Economic Law would say we don't want arbitrary increases in economic restrictions except for specific types of circumstances. And the difficulty is that specifying what national security is enough of an emergency to justify is left to the determination of countries. And so I think your point is that the WTO is not really undermined if countries rely on a UN Security Council resolution of sanctions, whereas maybe there's a little more undermining by other sanctions that are a wider swath of interpretation. But it is destabilizing that countries can choose what counts. And so is the US attack on Iran, the Russian attack on Ukraine, human rights, the labor conditions in Xinjiang, labor conditions in Bangladesh, and all of those decisions about which one gets a sanction are being decided at a unilateral level and declared as exempt from economic trade rules. And so while any one could be rule supporting, we think that the net effect raises uncertainty because it's moving from a fairly fixed set of you set your tariff at 10%, your tariff is 10%, to it's 10% until you decide it's not for a different reason that won't be judged. So that's why I see it as a little bit undermining the economic rule-based order. But good point that often sanctions are supporting other rules. And 301 is more within protection. It does not require a national security justification. So you might get national security logic and rhetoric thrown in, but there's nothing in the mandate of the law that requires that, and it has not traditionally been framed. And so I think just like in our paper, we sort of compare the Bush safeguard that was straight, a flood of imports hurting an industry, following up on an electoral campaign protection. We probably could also compare to a Section 301 as another protection. And we think the 232 is special because legally it has to be national security, rhetorically it's national security.
Great. Thank you for this very interesting talk. Focusing on the tariffs case, I was wondering how should we think about these spillover countries as differentiated from sanction states? Because you do mention that everyone is hit by the sanction in the tariffs case. Isn't all spillover states sanction state? And also in that case, I think you talked about finding where countries that are in the spillover set reduce trade away from the U.S. in steel and aluminum products. So I was wondering, how do we think about that compared to the previous finding where exposure with the sender, where you talk about sender compliance pressure, exposure with the sender does not lead to any effects about trade diversification.
Right. No, that's the tension in this shift to a different structure of analysis. And so certainly first point about why the spillover group and why not an effect in the direct. We have both in our main analysis, we don't try to theorize about the direct target of sanctions, and we accept there's a literature that there's really mixed effects because there's so much endogenous strategy and who gets targeted and when they build up. And so we haven't been trying to theorize the most directed target of the sanctions. And then here in this analysis, you're most dependent. I think actually it's not just that there's endogeneity, because that's less of a problem in this case. The real issue is that when there's so much trade, you may have more fixed product contracts. And so it's a little harder to move, but that's just speculative. And there is other evidence. The ITC had a report showing there wasn't as much movement of trade. We've seen the economists show that a lot of the tariffs were passed on to consumers. And so we could say that the top trade, there were multiple reasons why the ones that had the US as their top market are not changing as much. And I think you're right that we could talk more about it. But our real interest is the fact that the middle countries are moving. And your concern is, why are they moving also away from the US relative to the first analysis, which is a good question. I mean, the US is basically causing a shock to the entire system by hitting everyone at once. Seemed as an arbitrary sanction. And so we're treating that as a system shock rather than a parallel of a directed sanction event. And so that's how we are not trying to theorize about the relationship with the US. But we're just looking at the effect of, okay, how do you react? The way to diversify away from the source of uncertainty is to expand more partners. And that's the test we have here.
Loved it. Thanks for being here. Thanks, Ruofan. Super excited to have you here long term. So at the risk of getting in over my head, I got into the paper for a second. So as I understand the regression in the first part, the policy that it corresponds to is me as a sanctioning state sanctioning in this year. And so if I were trying to understand what impact that would have on the global system, it's like conditional on this year fixed effects, et cetera. But I'm imagining the world that I think might be closer to the one we're in, where states were like, okay, we'll see what the US does. And then they're updating over time based on the intensity and frequency of various sanctioning events, and that is shifting. And then eventually they hit a breaking point where they say, okay, we hit the threshold where now we have to diversify our trade in a way that we didn't think we had to before, because we thought this was like a temporary shock, but now it's like gone on too long, it's a sea level change. And I wondered if you change the estimation to basically have the cumulated over n years. See, I see that you have the leads of the outcome. If you had the cumulated over the last n years of like the intensity of cumulative exposure, if that would start to get at something like this aggregation, like how exposed have I been in the last 5 years to uncertainty that I didn't anticipate? Or maybe the estimation already gets at that policy, because then the policymaker is deciding not do I impose this sanction, but given that I imposed sanctions 7 times in the last 5 years, now will imposing a new sanction cause greater diversification? Maybe the whole thing's misguided.
As you're nodding your head, I'm going to let you jump in and answer first.
Yeah, I think two reaction. One is just sort of like from a implementation point of view. So like the way we sort of measure sanctions, so essentially it's like, is this country currently under a active sanction, right? So essentially it's not like it only turns out for 1 year during the year of imposition. It's like throughout the duration, for instance, sanction lasts 5 years, then within all those 5 years, it would be considered as sort of like an ongoing sort of like pressure.
Okay, so those accumulate.
Yeah, those would accumulate, right? So for example, if a country at some point get overlaid by multiple sanctions, right, that will come together within the calculation of that one particular year.
Okay.
But I think it's sort of like, I think there's also like theoretical point that's sort of interesting there in a way that, yeah, there's like you're kind of, essentially we're trying to think of like what our country looking at, right, when they're trying to make decisions on diversification. Like I think you're suggesting, well, like at some point you look at the hegemony and say, oh, like now US has gone completely crazy, but at some breaking point now we need to do.
Yeah.
But like there's, I think the way we've been thinking about it is sort of like, it's like trade is like fundamentally is a very relational thing, right? Like if you think of like China, when they look at, I don't know, when Canada and US have the lumber war, whatever, like that's less pertinent to them, where like whenever China, the US is going after, from top of my head, like Argentina, similar for, I think for like some fish export, like that's not what like that doesn't concern China, right? But like when the US started to go after Russia or like North Korea or Iran, like that's where China sort of, oh, actually, no, these are people like me, right? These are some of my friends. And if they're like involved, then there's a real chance that I might be next, while I actually, like now it's starting to affect my own trade network. And that's where I really need to start doing sort of like diversification. Now I need to react in a certain way, right? And then we were positing that it would be like along the line of diversification.
Yeah, I have a technical question. So basically my understanding is Section 301 and the section also happened in 2018 as a China-US trade war. And then how can you disentangle these two? Because those two things really happen exactly at the same time with your Section 232. And also for the standby countries, from the anecdotal evidence, we saw that many like other countries, they really benefit, like the Southeast Asia countries. And I saw you one line said this rerouting is not significant in your data set.
Right. So let me take that. The Section 301, you're right to highlight that there was a major Section 301 in 2018. For the steel aluminum analysis, we're only looking at the monthly steel aluminum trade flows. And so the Section 301 petition was on a broader set of products for China. And so I would never say that there's no connection. Obviously, cars affect steel. So I think there, we think we have a little more identification of a sharp shock because it was an announcement and we're looking at very fine-grained products, but trade is interconnected, and so there could be some related effects from the Section 301 that happened at the same time. So I think that's a useful point. In the early part of our analysis, we are deliberately trying to aggregate different types of sanctions, and so that they're a whole different form. But Section 301 is generally not considered a sanction because it doesn't have this national security rhetoric. And the second part of your question was about how, wait, You said it's different.
policy standing by countries.
Right.
The news always said they benefit so much.
Yes, I mean, what are the welfare effects of sanctions spillover leading to diversification? It is an interesting fact that I think diversifying your trade partners may help them do better. And so if Armenia and Azerbaijan are adding in more trade partners, that will enrich their economic diversity and resilience. And so it's not just that they might get a profit from a trade, but that they will have a more mature economy. And so there is a potential, if you wanted to go that level, to think about what is diversification doing for these economies. And in the case of transshipment, which we don't deny, we check that, there isn't a really suspicious level of high new products where a country didn't trade steel and suddenly they're like a major steel trader. That would be really suspicious. We can't deny that you were already trading some steel and then you add in a new cargo of steel that is from Russia. So that type of transshipment might be happening. Other economists have looked at it and found, we cite one paper that says it's not as big as people think, but I'll leave that to their paper. And then just to, again, ending on this note of the potential welfare gains, even if it is transshipment, in some ways that would lead to them being less dependent. And so countries that only traded with Russia now through transshipment, they're getting some of those boxes from Russia or boxes from China, and they're spreading them out across a lot of partners. If they later have a problem with Russia or China, they've got established trade relationships with a whole wider network. And so, I think that is an interesting, if you were to start thinking about policy implications.
I'm afraid that we are at time, but thank you so much for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you for a great set of questions.